Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar How to Audit Your Risk Tolerance Profiling Process. I'm Craig Saunders, your host for today, and we're going to be joined by two guests. First, Stewart Erskine is a consultant who's done a number of real-life audits on financial advice firms around their risk tolerance and risk profiling processes. Stewart's going to be here to tell us about what he found, and some of those results are not very encouraging at all. Then Paul Resnick from FinaMetrica will be here to guide us through the framework that Stewart used to conduct those audits. It's a 12-part checklist designed to help you sort the good from the bad when it comes to assessing and profiling risk tolerance. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes, and if risk profiling is something for which you are responsible, or even, heaven help us, liable, you'll gain a heap of valuable insights into about how to go about assessing the systems that you have in place now. But first, a few housekeeping issues that we must deal with. First of all, we are live today, so I will be seeing your questions as they come in. So please do be a part of the program. You can guide the discussions here. There's also a document that we'd like to share with you today. It's called the Due Diligence Checklist, and it's in the handout section on the Go to Webinar tab. You should just be able to download that file, and then you can use that as you go about preparing your own audits. We'd also like to share FinaMetrica with you. You can do a 30-day free trial of our entire system. Nothing is held back. Go to riskprofiling.com, look for the 30-day trial button, and you'll end up on this page where you can very easily subscribe to that. There's no credit card, no obligation needed. Now, after this webinar, we will be sending you an email follow-up. It will have a link into a recording of this program, so you can go back and check on any parts that you might have missed, or check on any parts that you want to hear again. So now let's kick off with Stewart Erskine, because it's always fascinating to find out about the skeletons that can be found lurking inside people's closets. As I said earlier, Stewart's been conducting a number of real-life audits on real-life firms, and he's found some real-life problems. One of the common themes emerging is that people think they have a solid, robust system in place, but when they tested it, it actually failed. Stewart, welcome to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are.
It's both, depending, as you say, depending on where our viewers are. Now, you had two core issues that you had to address. Was the process fit for purpose? That is, did it work at all? And second, is it true to label? That is, does it do what it says it's going to do? What did you find?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the firms that have employed us are firms that want good outcomes for their clients and want to do a good job, and so praise to them for that. What we did find was that many of them had processes that had grown up over a number of years. They may have created their own questionnaires. They may have taken questionnaires or questions from other questionnaires. Often they'd created their own scoring mechanism. And one thing that's common across all the systems that are generally put together by the firms themselves is they tend not to record the data other than on an individual basis. They don't record the data from a group-wide basis. So they have no mechanism for testing whether the questionnaire is functioning well or whether there are any issues with the questionnaire.
So we might call these homemade tests, if you like. Have they emerged simply because there's no regulator guidance on how you should go about it?
That's right. Regulation is not prescriptive, particularly in the UK. So the outcomes, investments need to be suitable for the clients, and the clients have to have gone through a process with the advisor, but that process could take many forms, and so the regulator isn't specific on how or what process should follow. But what the regulator has done in the UK is it's reviewed a number of case files and found that many financial advice firms' processes are lacking, the tools that they're using are lacking. And so really advisors are responding to the regulator and the increased requirements on them to make sure that consumer outcomes are positive.
Now, you're in the UK. That must be a particular problem there, because the UK regulator has a requirement that you know what systems that you're using and that you've tested them robustly.
That's right, and I think to be fair to advisors, the processes and the regulator have really firmed up what they want over a period of time. So advisors, when I look back to my own career when I worked for a short time as a financial advisor. Risk profiling questionnaires weren't really in existence and weren't used. The regulator requires you now to make sure investments are suitable for clients, and as part of that suitability process, you need to explore risk. And so many advisor firms have developed their own questionnaires, and this has happened over a period of time. And the questionnaires they take questions from existing questionnaires, they make up the questions, they concoct their own process.
The image that sort of pops into my mind as we discuss this is of the old Western movie sets where you'd see the facade of the Western town, but it was all held up by planks of wood and there was nothing in behind it. I think a lot of people might be under the misapprehension that they have a solid, robust process, and they've never tried to look underneath it to see whether there's anything there.
I think that's right. And where it's more worrying, when you have a questionnaire that perhaps has a number of issues, and I know you're going to explore with Paul the due diligence sort of checklist, and that helps reveal those issues. One of the big concerns is if these questionnaires become online and lead to some form of automated advice, then we would expose real significant problems. Whilst you've got an advisor working with a client, even some of the deficits in the questionnaire can be picked up with the advisor and the interaction with the client. But for many, the questionnaires are lacking and leave the firm and the client open to risk. And that's why I think we've been asked to do a number of assessments.
And you found that essentially some of them were documenting and processing failure because their questionnaire simply didn't work.
That's right. One of the big points that many firms don't gather is they don't gather the data. So they can't initially tell you whether the questionnaire is effective or ineffective. So one of the first things we do if we're looking at a self-created questionnaire is we ask the organisation to pass us the data and start collating the data, because it's only when you look at the data you can then identify issues with particular questions. One of the issues is, does this actually discriminate? And in some questionnaires we've evaluated all respondents or majority of respondents that may have different attitudes to risk have all answered the questionnaire in the same way. So therefore you can conclude that the question doesn't discriminate between high and low attitude to risk. So by not collating the data, they have no evidence to suggest whether the questionnaire works or doesn't work. That's one of the big findings.
As we go through this due diligence process, it's going to become apparent how much work you have to do in constructing a test, that you need norms to compare it against, you need different populations, you need academic inputs. I'm not trying to be harsh, but I think in many financial services firms, you just wouldn't get the resources to be that rigorous in constructing a test in the first place, would you?
That's right. The overhead to look and review at an in-house questionnaire is a fairly significant overhead. It's an overhead for the external costs for people like me evaluating it, and the internal costs of perhaps changing systems, collating data, getting people to review files. So there is quite a big cost in putting forward your own questionnaire. There's no doubt of that. It's a lower cost, lower risk route to purchasing one produced by a company that specialises in questionnaires.
So let's get to some of the details of what you found. What were the common design flaws or the common faults that you came across?
Well, there are many faults. One of the big ones is, as I stated before, is not collecting the data at the end of it. So not being able to prove over the population, over all of your clients, whether the questionnaire is effective or ineffective. The next fault that's often present is some of the questions. The questions themselves may not be clear. They may bring in multiple subjects, so they may be asking a client about different aspects of risk under one question, and so it's then hard to separate out the client's answer. Many of the options that clients are given can often be unclear. So it's really the whole process, from the way the questions are drafted to the scoring of the questions themselves. So we've seen questionnaires that have their own scoring algorithm, and when we've actually reviewed it, it would be impossible to hit some of the scores, particularly on the low or the high risk end. So really that whole process has revealed flaws. It's negated in part by the advisors documenting the advice process. So as I stated before, if they were operating automated advice, this would be hugely problematic and would lead to major failures with client outcome and unsuitable investments. The fact that the clients are being advised face-to-face does reduce the impact of the questionnaire. But if you were to have clients that lost a great deal of money and were to take the organisation to court, it would be indefensible, certainly from scrutiny. So, they're leaving themselves open.
I guess a comparison might be, I'm smart enough to ignore my GPS when it tells me to drive into the river, whereas an automated car might just do what the GPS says.
Absolutely, and that's the major concern, because many firms are moving into the online robo-advice market for a section of their clients, and if they apply their own questionnaires to that process and have no intervention from an outside advisor, they'll be running into major difficulties.
So I guess we can't escape that if that foundation, that risk tolerance assessment test, which is the foundation of the profile, if that's wrong, that calls into doubt everything that follows, including the investment recommendations, the financial plan.
That's right. I mean, if you're incorrectly assessing the client's risk and then aligning portfolios to that incorrect risk assessment, then you're causing poor outcomes for the client. In addition, one other area that many organisations are falling into is they're not assessing partners separately. So the partners are tending to complete a single questionnaire, and this can be problematic because the dominant partner, the score may reflect their views and not the views of the other partner, and so there are issues around that process as well. So assessing an individual's attitude to risk and then looking at the gap between husband and wife or between partners is an important part of the advice process.
And I just want to stress something that you said earlier, because I think it is important. We're not talking about cowboy shops here. We're talking about well-established, respectable financial institutions that think they have it right, but in reality don't.
That's right, and they're well-intentioned. And the fact that we're assessing some of the questionnaires is testament to that well-intentioned approach. And a lot of this is born from the UK regulator looking at and examining financial advisors' files and looking at the investment outcomes and raising questions about the suitability process that they're operating. So these are not cowboy firms. These are firms that want to help their clients and create good client outcomes, and they've just grown, a process has grown up within the business that falls short for a number of reasons.
Okay, Stuart, we'll leave it there for today. I've just popped up on screen the due diligence questions, the framework that we're going to run through in a moment with Paul Resnick. But thanks very much for telling us the stories of what you found there.
Thank you, Craig.
And folks, this due diligence document that Stewart was talking about is the exact process that he applied when he conducted those audits. So you can download this, as I said, it's in the handout section there today. So if you look for that, you should be able to download that to your computer now. And any moment we should have Paul Resnick coming online to join us. Paul is from FinaMetrica. He's both a co-founder and director of the company. Paul, do we have you there?
You should have me here, Craig. Can you see me yet?
I can't see you, but I can hear you, so we're going to soldier on with that. Now I can see you as well. Folks,
I'm coming from a long way away.
Paul is in London, I'm in Melbourne, Australia, you're wherever you are in the world. It's a wonder this system works at all. It's quite remarkable. So, Paul, first up, tell me how FinaMetrica ended up creating this due diligence process instead of it being one of the many regulators around the world who say it's a compulsory thing to do.
I just suspect that it's very hard for regulators to actually understand or even endorse any particular method. So we've been working on risk profiling. We started almost 25 years ago thinking about the problem we launched in '98. It was very clear when I talk with people that they tell me they're agnostic to their risk profiling, as if it has no consequence on the quality of their business and their relationships with their clients. And so over time what we've tried to do is provide a framework for people to judge what we do, and so they can also compare it to their other alternatives. So we developed this over the last 2 or 3 years as a consequence of people saying, well, there's really no difference. I can get a free test or I can design my own. And what we saw, and we still see, is a huge amount of movement when the markets move, and all of our viewers and listeners will know the challenge is when people have unframed expectations in terms of market movement and their portfolios are inconsistent with their risk tolerance, they tend to buy and sell at the wrong time, and that has an impact upon the overall performance of their portfolios. And when we look at some of the numbers bandied about by Dalbar, Morningstar and Vanguard, that could easily be 1 to 2% per annum of return is not taken into account. It's lost because clients are moving their portfolios around at the wrong time and the wrong market movements.
So who are the sort of people who are going to be wanting to apply this audit process? What sort of job titles and responsibilities or liabilities do they have?
Well, I think it starts at the very top of an organisation. Anybody that's a director or a senior manager would like to, I've been using the language over the last while, would like to sleep at night knowing that they're using the very best tools that are available rather than shortcuts. Shortcuts invariably come back and bite people, and we only have to see the number of complaints and number of engagements that happen when the market's correct. This time last year there was a major US correction, and I remember reading stories of millions of people ringing the major fund managers and saying what should they do. Part of that problem is they're outside their comfort zone and they haven't had their expectations appropriately framed. That's the magic of doing risk profiling and getting risk tolerance correct.
And of course, those millions of phone calls that come in, they're all an expense that people have to bear within the business. Let's run through what's in this audit process. And it starts with the first question is face validity. Does the questionnaire make sense? Is it really testing financial risk tolerance? As Stewart told us, this is the first hurdle and people often stumble and fall on it.
Yes, so the first group of questions often cover a gamut of issues that are beyond risk tolerance. And the classic ones is they'll ask questions about goals, they'll ask questions about time horizon, and of course that's not risk tolerance, they are different issues. So the starting point is we're trying to find out an individual's personality point on risk tolerance. In our case we measure it in a score of 0 to 100, 1 to 100, and people appear somewhere along that gamut. If the question isn't a personality question, but a context question, it will only confuse the outcome.
So are people doing that just because they don't understand that you shouldn't be mixing oil and water together like that?
I presume so. It's all forms of activity in financial planning benefit from specialisation and nuanced reflection. We see a lot of people spending an inordinate amount of time building portfolios, but there's an excitement in being able to pick stocks and major trends. It's perhaps not as exciting to understand individual differences. In our case, we're trying very hard to assess individuals' risk tolerance, but even that's an average. What we're also looking at is, are they different in the way they answer particular questions? And in our case, if somebody answers some questions high and some questions low, we'll report those differences, even though there will be an average score somewhere in the middle.
I've just highlighted point C here. Are there a variety of questions? Do they differ from each other? Is there any repetition? Because I know a particular bugbear of yours is that you see tests that are one question asked 10 times.
Yes, that's a sort of classic. We see that in some of the gamble tests in the marketplace. They're basically assuming that given an upside and a downside, they're searching to find what that balance is. It's prospect theory. So essentially they're asking the same question multiple times. Now that raises a couple of issues. One, it doesn't test anything else other than people's numerical literacy. And as we know, the level of numeracy is unbelievably low. So if you don't ask an array of questions with different intent, you're really reliant on people understanding. And as I said earlier, you want to be able to show differences. So many of these just keep asking the same question until they think they've solved the ratio of upside to downside and then make a recommendation. It's possible that's risk tolerance, but in many cases it might just be they're just answering the questions.
Now we've sort of started to go to this question too, the design provenance issue already. Who built the test? What expertise do they have? Were they really experts, or was it just done over a boozy lunch?
Yeah, well, we certainly started with this over a boozy lunch, I can tell you that. It was in the old part of Sydney. Jeff Davey and I had lunch several times through the mid-90s as we worked our way through, saying, look, we think there's a weakness in planning, the place where clients, their money, and advisors all got together. We certainly found fairly quickly that we needed to bring in outside expertise to support our process. We found the original work from the American College. We worked with the University of New South Wales with commercial psychologists from Chandler and McLeod, a major Australian firm. It became fairly obvious that while we knew what we wanted from the test, we had to go back into deep academia and in deep research, because there was at that stage a long background in behavioural economics, behavioural finance, but very little around risk tolerance. So for us it was a creative process of discovering the problem and then trying to find a solution and the appropriate people to help us solve it. That brought us to psychometrics.
And Section 3 sort of dovetails into that, which is the academic research and independent testing and scrutiny. Your website is littered with academic papers that draw on your data and your processes, but it's an important part that many of your competitors out there simply don't offer that sort of integrity.
Well, for us, this is, in a sense, it's a labour of love. We think that the world is a better place if people are invested for the long term and aren't churning their portfolios. It leads to a more stable economy. It leaves money to be invested in capital markets. So that feels a much safer place to be. So we work hard to confirm the integrity of what we're doing. If we just asserted it, that's an empty assertion. So whenever we've got the opportunity, we work with academics. We do a lot of work with the University of New South Wales. We work with a number of American universities, and more recently we've been working with the London School of Economics to look at the integrity of our questions and the answers to those questions, because clearly we designed FinaMetrica 25 years ago based on science that went back 25 years before that. So things have moved on there. This was even before the iPhone had arrived in the marketplace, and we're constantly looking to see, is there a persistency in the integrity of what we did, and that's why we make sure that we're working with as many universities on useful projects at any one time as we can find.
The next question is, what assumptions underpin the questionnaire? It was clear from talking to Stewart that in many cases there are no assumptions. The questionnaire just is there.
Yes, I guess the fundamental assumption in our case is there is a value in knowing somebody's financial risk tolerance as opposed to measuring something else. I'd come from a background of running a life insurance company and an asset management business, and like many businesses that went through the '87 crash, we saw huge outflows of money and a huge number of disappointed investors coming to complain. I'd never seen an investor. I'd only dealt with intermediaries before the '87 crash. So what got us going in this space was to solve a real problem, which was it messed up profitability. You have complaining clients, they're withdrawing money, they're telling their friends. Your whole business changes from being an engagement process to give people investments to dealing with complaints and people taking their money out. That's just, it does terrible things to your profitability over time.
Now, Paul, the relevance, the norms and test samples sounds like it's a bit statistical and pointy-headed, but it's actually important. If you're designing a test for use by retirees, for example, you don't test it on college students if you want to get the proper result.
It's always much easier to do it in college students because they're around and they're happy to take a few bob for actually giving their insight. But it is clear that you need to have the people that you're providing a service to. And in our case, we've clearly now got an inordinate number of individuals who have taken our test over. Our database starts in 1998. It's in many countries. We've got some demographics that tell us the various age groups. So we have a sort of self-learning process. It started quite humbly, but now with 1 million responses in multiple countries, we're able to see very clear patterns of any changes with education, with age, with sex, with country. And that gives us the confidence to assert as we do, and it often disturbs people to say risk tolerance tends not to change in a material manner once it's been established in late adolescence, early adulthood. And for many people, that's a very difficult statement. So last time I said this on a webinar, I think we had a number of people saying, do we have any evidence? And the evidence is the answers to 1 million tests over almost 20 years.
The old "I've got 1 million reasons why you're wrong" response. Now, Paul, I'm going to dance through a couple of these questions because time's coming up against us. Usability testing is exactly what it says. Can clients understand and use the test, particularly if they're doing it on their own? Question 7, are you able to articulate and demonstrate an understanding of the questionnaire, is what do you use the result for? What does the result mean and how do you use it? And people might like to consult one of our recent webinars on how you map a risk tolerance score into an investment decision as part of that. Question 8, is the technical support that's on offer? Can you ask somebody to interpret something for you? If you run into strife, is there help for you? Is there a technical manual at least to refer to? And question 9 is the one that I want to pause on for a moment. Component or factor analysis. This sounds very oblique, but it's actually a very important thing. Is the questionnaire designed just to assess risk tolerance? As Stewart pointed out earlier, Paul, often it's not. It's designed to do any number of things.
Well, we don't know in many cases what it is designed to do. The intent, of course, is to help people get to a portfolio. But as we've identified very early in the piece, you need to understand the factors. One factor in a recommendation is this portfolio consistent with that individual's tolerance for financial risk? That's a psychological preference. The others are, in fact, financial. And the other two major factors is that portfolio, will that actually deliver the assets to meet the liabilities as they fall due in normal times, with normal capital market assumptions? But the final one is, what about capacity for loss? Can that client have the life they want, knowing that every 10 years or so, the markets melt? That consequence may be for a year, it might be for 5 years or 10 years. And that's the fundamental model of financial planning. When you mix those things up in your scoring algorithm, you actually don't give the client the opportunity of owning the plan. It's the algorithm, the conflated 3 factors that give a recommendation, and that's just incorrect and puts the business and the client in jeopardy.
Now, there's three questions that are quite statistical at the back end, so we won't delve into them now. The correlation matrix, this shows the strength of the relationships between the questions. The reliability, I'm not even going to ask you what a Cronbach alpha score is, but people can look up this in the document that they can take from the handout section today. And further evidence of construct validity is just other things that would point to the test being reasonable, which includes, Paul, I guess, that how closely the results from this test align with other tests. Are they in the same ballpark?
So internal stuff, of course, relates to if you give the test and you give the test again later. And I think in one case we had about a 7 years gap between the first test being taken by an individual and the second time. You would like to believe that if all else being equal, you should get a very similar score. So the answer is you're looking for reliability in that the test is interpreted the same way each time an individual takes it.
Okay, we'll put the test away for the moment. As I said, people can go and download that from the handout section, and we do urge them to do so. But Paul, that's the hows of an audit. Let's look at the whys. Why would somebody do this? Who's checking up on them?
Well, at this stage, very few people. This is the great challenge. For many, it starts off with a personal need for professionalism. I want to run the best business I possibly can. And to a large degree, our initial clients followed that characteristic. Since 2008, the regulators around the world have been much more consistent, as we talked about, I think, in our podcast the other day. They want to see that the recommendations meet the needs of the client. And one of the preferences is to have taken into account an individual's risk tolerance. Now, in practical levels, you'd like to know where your risks are. If you've got somebody with a high risk tolerance, you know that person might well be chasing the market when it's booming. And you want to know that you've got to manage that individual. At the other end, if you've got a low risk tolerant individual, you want to know the market's correct, that you've given them a portfolio that best manages their likely behaviour, and you can get to that. If you don't have an accurate assessment of risk tolerance, you won't know who those people will be. And as we know, it doesn't take very much to have your reputation dragged in the mud. If you're in America, the risk is that half a dozen people get together and it's class action. In the UK, it is a regulator that fines people several tens of millions of pounds.
I thought you were going to say the risk in America is that the president will tweet against you.
There is always that risk.
Okay, Paul, we've snuck a couple of minutes past our time today, but I'm sure people won't mind, but I will bid you farewell for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Craig. Good talking with you.
Now, folks, we'll get wrapped up and send you on your way. I just want to take a few moments to tell you about some other webinars from FinaMetrica. On our website at riskprofiling.com, let me just put that up there for you now. At riskprofiling.com, you'll find recordings of a couple of our recent webinars about mapping risk tolerance to investment decisions and framing investor expectations. And they're the second and third legs of a risk profiling toolkit that often don't get discussed very much. People just focus on it being a test and nothing else. Coming up in the next month, we have a couple more webinars on the way for you. The first is on why psychometrics is the gold standard of risk profiling. You would have heard Paul talk about the academic pathway that led FinaMetrica to psychometrics, and we'll delve deeply into that and compare and contrast it against some other methods. And three essential components of a risk profiling system, which are that risk tolerance test, a mapping process to make the result meaningful, and then an framing of the investor and framing and management of the investor's expectations. But from all of the team here at FinaMetrica, thanks for being with us today. That's it. We do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. I'm Craig Saunders. Bye for now.